When I first pulled my old Ford truck through the dusty gravel road that led to the front gate of the ranch, I knew I was stepping into history, but I had no idea I was also stepping into a fight that would make the Wild West look like a Sunday picnic. So before I tell you what happened, hit that subscribe button and stick around, because this is a story about power, greed, and how one man can flip the script on an entire HOA. The ranch had stood here for 150 years. It's weathered. Barn boards soaked in sun and storms, its pastures rolling like waves of gold in the wind, and its fences as straight as the pride of the family that had owned it for generations, until me. I'd bought it fair and square, closing the deal in cash after months of legal wrangling with the heirs who couldn't keep it together. And I was ready to spend my mornings on horseback and my evenings watching the sun set over the hills. The morning after I moved in, before the coffee had even finished brewing, the sound of tires grinding up the gravel drive cut through the quiet. A convoy of shiny SUVs rolled up like some kind of suburban invasion force, chrome badges flashing. In the early light, and before I could even step off the porch, the doors flew open, and out stepped a swarm of well-dressed, stiff-backed men and women, clipboards in hand, wearing the smug expressions of people who think they own everything they see. Leading them was a tall, sharp-faced woman with short, blonde hair and a blazer that screamed self-pointed authority. She didn't bother with a hello. Instead, she looked me up and down like I was some trespasser and announced, "You're on HOA property. We'll need to see your purchase, documentation, and discuss terms for your compliance or surrender of the property." I almost laughed, but then I saw the way the others fanned out, inspecting my fences, taking photos of my barn, jotting notes like they were building a case against me. "I think you're mistaken," I said, holding my coffee mug steady in my hand. "This is private property, not part of any HOA. Most, thin, almost reptilian, not anymore. The subdivision expansion was approved last year. Your ranch is now within HOA jurisdiction, and as the new owners of the association's interest in this land, we have first right to acquire it. Consider this your notice." I couldn't believe the gall, but I didn't let it show. I knew enough about property law to smell when someone was bluffing. But I also knew these people wouldn't be here if they didn't think they had some angle. As the morning dragged on, they peppered me with demands: remove your livestock, repaint the barn to approved colors, submit landscaping plans. Most importantly, prepare to vacate so the HOA could develop the land into a planned lakefront community. Every sentence dripped with entitlement, and the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just about some suburban HOA rules. They wanted the entire ranch gone. What they didn't know, however, was that while I was a newcomer to their neighborhood, I wasn't new to the world of corporate power plays. I'd spent 20 years running multi-million-dollar projects in industries where backroom deals and hostile takeovers were daily occurrences, and the moment they stepped onto my land, I started running the same mental playbook I'd used to dismantle some of the most stubborn boards in the business. Their leadership introduced herself as Karen Whitmore. HOA president kept trying to push me into signing preliminary compliance agreements, which I promptly refused. I could tell she wasn't used to being told no. Her voice got tighter, her eyes colder. And at one point she even threatened to have the HOA's security enforcement team come by if I didn't cooperate. "Do that," I said calmly, "and make sure they bring their legal counsel with them, because I'll have mine waiting." The group finally retreated, leaving a cloud of dust behind them and a stack of papers on my porch, full of so-called bylaws and community mandates they thought applied to me. I stood there watching them drive away, sipping the last of my coffee, already piecing together my counterattack. If they thought I was just some rancher who would roll over, they were about to learn the hard way that I was something much worse. For them, I was their new boss. They didn't know it yet, but the HOA's bylaws had a loophole so big you could ride a herd of cattle through it. And thanks to a little research I'd done before buying the ranch, I already had a plan to use. What was about to happen would turn their little power club upside down. The next morning I was woken up by the sound of trucks and SUVs pulling up outside my ranch gates. And through my window, I saw a convoy of HOA board members spilling out like they were some sort of special task force, clipboards in hand, pointing at my fences and my barn as if they had already decided my fate, and leading the pack was the same smug-faced man from yesterday. Harold, with his two loyal sidekicks behind him, each dressed like they were about to audit every inch of my property. And they didn't even bother to knock or wait for me to come out. They let themselves through the gate, marching straight up my driveway with a confidence that could only come from years of bullying weaker neighbors. But as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, the atmosphere shifted ever so slightly, because they realized I wasn't scrambling to meet them halfway or apologizing for anything. I just stood there and sipped my coffee like they were uninvited salesmen. And Harold was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescension as he said, "We've reviewed your case and decided the historic status of your ranch is irrelevant under our HOA jurisdiction," which made me chuckle because I could already tell he didn't actually know who he was talking to, so I simply asked, "Oh, really? And what jurisdiction would that be exactly?" And he started listing off rules from their so-called community covenant. Pages of petty restrictions about fence heights, approved paint colors, and lawn maintenance schedules that clearly didn't apply to my 150-year-old ranch that existed before their subdivision even had a name. And when I pointed that out, Harold's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly, saying, "The HOA has recently acquired governing rights over the surrounding lands," which made one of his sidekicks nod vigorously as if that somehow made their overreach legal. But the truth was they were bluffing. They had filed some annexation paperwork that hadn't even been approved yet. And I had already seen the county maps that proved my ranch wasn't part of their community's jurisdiction. So I decided to play along for a moment, pretending to be intimidated, even offering to look over their documents if they'd like to send them, which Harold took as an opportunity to push harder, suggesting I save myself trouble by voluntarily deeding the land to the HOA in exchange for a generous payout. And that's when I realized they actually believed they could scare me into selling. So I smiled politely, told them I'd consider it, and watched them leave looking satisfied. But what they didn't know was that while they were in their board meeting last night, I was in another meeting, one that made their little HOA power trip meaningless because last week, during the property sale, I had been quietly nominated to replace the outgoing HOA president by a group of disgruntled homeowners who were sick of Harold's leadership. And the county had already processed the paperwork, which meant that at this very moment Harold was lecturing me about rules while I was technically his new boss. Though I wasn't going to reveal that just yet because I wanted to see how far he'd take his threats. So as soon as they left, I made a few phone calls. First to my attorney to let him know to prepare a notice of authority transfer, and second, to the HOA's management company to arrange for an emergency board meeting later this week. And in the meantime, I decided to observe Harold's behavior closely, which didn't take long because by that afternoon, I caught him standing outside my property with a few of his cronies, measuring my driveway with a tape measure like they were building a case against me, so I drove my truck slowly past them, giving a friendly wave, and they looked rattled. Probably wondering why I seemed so unfazed, but their confusion was only going to get worse because tomorrow, I plan to send official HOA notices signed by me to every homeowner announcing a complete leadership change and an audit of the board's past decisions, which I knew would terrify Harold because I'd heard rumors about shady HOA spending, overpriced contractor deals, and personal reimbursements that never should have been approved. And if those rumors turned out to be true, Harold wasn't just going to lose his position, he might end up answering to more than just me. So that night, I sat at my desk in the ranch office, going through every document I could get my hands on, finding line items that made no sense and projects that seemed suspiciously inflated, and by the time I was done, I had a thick folder of evidence ready to bring to the emergency meeting. But I wasn't going to hit them with everything at once first. I needed to let Harold dig his own grave a little deeper, so I decided to play the long game, and judging by how desperate they were to push me out, knew it wouldn't take long before they tried something reckless, something I could use too. Not just secure my position, but make sure they could never come after my ranch or anyone else's again. When the next morning came, I woke up earlier than usual, the sun just peeking over the horizon and casting that golden light across the sprawling fields of my ranch. The place was quiet, except for the distant sound of cattle and the creak of the old windmill. I brewed my coffee, sat on the porch, and thought about the boldness of the HOA board from the day before. They had stormed onto my property like it belonged to them, demanded ownership, and expected me to just roll over. They didn't know who they were dealing with. My years in corporate negotiations and my background in law meant I knew how to dismantle overreach. And now that I had the HOA presidency, I had both the authority and the documentation to turn their game upside down. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from one of the board members, Tom Sanders, the very man who had been shouting the loudest yesterday. He had no idea I was the new president, and his message was full of threats about forcing me to sell or facing legal consequences. I smirked, because the only legal consequence coming was for them. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent the next few hours going through the HOA's financial records, which as president I had full access to. What I found was worse than I expected. Unauthorized spending, missing funds, and suspicious transfers to personal accounts linked to 2 of the board members. It was a goldmine of corruption, enough to get them not only removed from the board, but possibly investigated by the state attorney. I printed out the most damning documents and tucked them into a folder. My next step was to call a special meeting of the HOA, one that they couldn't legally refuse to attend. The bylaws were crystal clear. A president could call a meeting. With 48 hours' notice, failure to attend without a valid reason was grounds for immediate removal from the board. By noon, I had sent the notices by email and certified mail, with the meeting set for Friday at the community hall. Just as I hit send, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw 2 familiar SUVs pulling into my driveway. And his sidekick, Lisa Grant, the treasurer. They got out, not even bothering to knock before stomping up onto my porch. Tom's face was red, and Lisa clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon. "We told you to meet our demands, and now we're giving you one last chance," Tom barked. "Either you sign over the deed today, or we'll start enforcement actions." I set my coffee cup down slowly, stood up, and looked them both in the eye. "Funny you should mention enforcement actions," I said, reaching for the folder, "because as of yesterday, I'm the HOA president. And I've got some questions for you too about these missing funds." I opened the folder and held up the first page, a printout showing a $14,000 transfer from the HOA account to an account under Lisa's name. Lisa's smug expression evaporated and Tom's eyes flickered nervously. "That's none of your business," Lisa snapped, but her voice shook. "Oh, it's very much my business," I replied, stepping forward. "And in 2 days, the entire HOA membership will hear about it at the special meeting I've just called. You'll have the chance to explain these transactions in front of everyone, or better yet, to a criminal investigator." Tom tried to recover his composure, but his voice came out strained. "You can't just—" "I can, and I have," I interrupted, cutting him off. "You're not in control anymore. This ranch is mine, and now so is the HOA. So unless you'd like to leave in handcuffs today, I suggest you get off my property before I call the sheriff." They stared at me for a moment, clearly torn between bluster and retreat, then finally turned and walked back to their SUVs without another word. I watched them drive away, knowing this was just the beginning. The real showdown would come at the meeting, and I had every intention of making sure they didn't leave with their positions intact or their reputations unscathed. That night, as I locked up the ranch house, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and calm. For the first time since I moved here, I was looking forward to facing the HOA. They thought they were dealing with a clueless newcomer. They had no idea I was about to burn their whole operation to the ground. The week after the board meeting was pure chaos, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the HOA members who had aligned themselves with Karen were suddenly realizing they had far less power than they thought, and they were scrambling to undermine me before the changes I'd promised could take root. And Karen herself was in full retaliation mode, showing up outside the ranch gates in her golf cart with a bullhorn, shouting about unfit leadership and preserving neighborhood tradition, while a few of her allies passed out flyers, claiming I was going to bring unwanted elements into the HOA by removing restrictions. A phrase that was so vague and discriminatory it made my blood boil. And while their smear campaign was laughable to anyone with common sense, it did have the effect of making some quieter residents nervous. So I decided it was time to go on the offensive, starting with transparency. Because if the members saw what the board had been doing with their fees over the years, they'd understand why Karen and her clique were fighting so hard to keep control. And so I spent several late nights in the office combing through financial records, bank statements, and meeting minutes, uncovering purchase orders for lavish dinners, consulting fees that went to board members' relatives, and even an $18,000 landscaping bill for Karen's private yard. Paid entirely out of HOA funds, which was not only unethical but illegal. And as I collected these documents, I planned a special meeting open to every HOA member, printing enough packets for each household and sending out certified invitations, knowing they couldn't claim ignorance later. But the moment the notices went out, the war escalated. Karen started sending threatening letters to my home, accusing me of defamation and warning me that I was making a big mistake by poking around in HOA finances. And one night, as I was leaving the office, I caught two of her allies, Bill and Sandra, snooping around the building's back door, obviously trying to gain entry to the locked records room, and when I called out to them, they scurried off like startled raccoons, muttering something about just checking security, which was so ridiculous I almost laughed, but the tension was real. So one upgraded the office security system, installed cameras, and even asked a friend from the sheriff's department to keep an eye on things in case Karen decided to escalate to vandalism or worse. And sure enough, just 2 days later, someone spray-painted "traitor" across the front gate of my ranch, which I documented and reported immediately. Not because I thought the culprits would be caught, but because every step they took against me was another piece of evidence for when the legal hammer eventually dropped. And when the night of the special meeting came, the community center was packed, with nearly every seat filled. People buzzing with curiosity and tension, and I wasted no time. Walking up to the podium and handing out the financial packets, then calmly explaining where their dues had really been going, pointing out each questionable expense with receipts. To back it up, and I could see the change in the room as murmurs turned into outrage, neighbors whispering to each other, eyes darting toward Karen and her supporters, who were visibly squirming in their seats. And when I opened the floor for questions, the floodgates opened. People who'd been silent for years were now demanding answers, asking how Karen could justify spending thousands on her personal projects while ignoring needed repairs to the community pool and neglecting the shared walking trails. And Karen tried to shout over them, claiming it was all standard practice. But nobody was buying it anymore, and by the end of the meeting, a petition had started circulating calling for her immediate removal from the board, which I knew she wouldn't take lying down. And sure enough, that night she posted a furious rant on the HOA's private Facebook group accusing me of staging the financial records and claiming I had doctored documents, which was laughable considering every page was an original copy straight from the locked records room. But her accusations did make one thing clear: she was desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, so I doubled down on my plan. Meeting privately with residents who were on the fence, reassuring them, answering their questions, and making it clear that my goal was to protect the ranch and the community, not to divide it. But Karen must have realized she was losing ground fast, because the next move she made was a bold and dangerous one. She called for an emergency board session without my consent, claiming she had the authority to override my position as president, which was a blatant violation of our bylaws. And when I showed up at the so-called meeting, she had her little circle of loyalists gathered, whispering in the corner like they were plotting a coup. But the moment I stepped in with a copy of the bylaws in hand and a digital recorder running, they froze, realizing they'd just been caught in the act of attempting an illegal removal. And I knew right then that the tide was turning in my favor, but I also knew Karen wouldn't go quietly, that the fight for the ranch and for control of the HOA was far from over. When the board members realized they were boxed into a legal trap they couldn't wriggle out of, the mood in the room shifted from bluster to quiet panic. Though Karen tried to mask her unease by keeping her arms folded and her voice loud enough to echo against the wooden beams of the ranch's old meeting hall, declaring that they would never allow someone like me to undermine the integrity of the community, as if integrity meant bullying homeowners into submission. But her words carried no weight anymore because every HOA member in attendance had just witnessed the paper trail I presented, every unlawful citation, every falsified maintenance fine, every urgent community project fee that was nothing more than an excuse to siphon money into their pockets, and the realization was dawning on them that their queen bee was cornered. I leaned forward slowly, letting my chair creak in the silence, and said that the bylaws not only gave me the power to dissolve the board with a majority vote, but also to appoint interim officers until the next election. And since I now held the voting rights of the 5 largest property parcels in the HOA, including the ranch, the outcome was already decided. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some residents shifting in their seats as they looked at each other, perhaps considering for the first time in years what it might feel like to live without the constant harassment of Karen's reign. And then, without waiting for permission, I called for the vote, knowing full well that the outcome was a foregone conclusion. And when the hands went up, hesitant at first, then in a wave of reluctant defiance, Karen's face drained of color. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to, because the weight of what had just happened was sinking in for everyone. And as I announced that the motion had passed and that the HOA board as they knew it was officially dissolved, there was an audible sigh of relief from several homeowners. Karen shot to her feet, sputtering about lawsuits and appeals. But before she could storm out, I reminded her in front of the crowd that under the bylaws, she was legally obligated to hand over all HOA records, keys, and financial accounts within 48 hours, or she would be in violation of state statutes that carried both fines and potential jail time. And her bluster faltered for just a moment before she turned on her heel and walked out, slamming the door so hard the old hinges rattled. The next 2 days were a flurry of activity as I oversaw the collection of HOA files, hard drives, and access cards. The few volunteers from the community stepping in to help catalog years of documents that revealed an even deeper well of corruption than I had suspected, including evidence that the previous board had been quietly selling off community land to outside developers without informing the homeowners. By the end of the week, I had appointed a new interim board, people with actual stakes in the community's well-being, not personal vendettas, and began drafting a plan to return control of the HOA to its members, making sure every policy was transparent and every decision was put to a vote. The ranch, which had been the flashpoint for all of this, was now the official meeting place and community hub, symbolic and literal center of our newfound independence. And while I knew Karen would probably try to stir trouble from the shadows, the truth was she had lost the one thing she had used to control people: fear. And without it, she was just another loud voice that could be ignored. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, and I knew they were scrambling. Karen's arrogance had clearly put them in a dangerous spot, and now they were scrambling to contain the damage. I could see from the blinds of my ranch office that 3 cars had pulled up outside the HOA's so-called community center. Karen, Greg, and a man I didn't recognize got out, all dressed in formal clothes like they were going to some kind of courtroom instead of a board meeting. My phone pinged a text from my friend Daniel, who had been my eyes and ears inside the HOA for months before I even moved in. He wrote, "Heads up, Karens. Pushing for a vote to nullify your ownership rights. They think they found a loophole in the deed." I smirked, because I knew that so-called loophole was already closed the moment I became the HOA president. They were about to waste hours chasing smoke. I decided not to interfere yet. Let them think they had a fighting chance. Let them more rope I gave them, the harder they'd hang themselves when the truth came out. I spent the rest of the morning organizing paperwork in my office and going through old ranch records. Every file I read reminded me why this land mattered, not just to me, but to my family's history. The 150-year-old property wasn't just dirt and grass. It was a living piece of heritage, with buildings my great-great-grandfather had raised with his own hands. The thought of some power-hungry HOA committee paving it over for modern amenities made my blood boil. Around noon, Daniel called. "They're calling it a special revocation," he said. "Karen's saying you can't be president because you weren't a member when the board was formed." I almost laughed. I said, "Daniel, tell her the bylaws were rewritten last month," I said. "I signed them in front of a notary. That clause doesn't exist anymore." He chuckled. "Oh, this is going to be good." 2 hours later, Karen herself knocked on my ranch office door. She didn't even wait for me to answer before she walked in like she owned the place. Greg followed her, holding a stack of papers. Like he was about to serve me with legal documents. "We're here to inform you," Karen started, in that high-pitched voice of hers, "that the board has voted to nullify your presidency. Effective immediately, you're removed from the HOA, and ownership of this ranch will revert to the association pending sale to approved buyers." I just leaned back in my chair, folded my arms, and stared at her. "Karen," I said slowly, "do you realize what you've just done?" She smirked, taking back what was stolen. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my own a stack of papers, all notarized, signed, and filed with the county clerk. These are the revised HOA bylaws, signed and approved last month. Not only am I still president, but per Section 4, Clause C, any attempt to remove the president without cause is void. And since I control the meeting schedule and quorum, your so-called vote isn't even legally binding. Karen's face went pale, and Greg shifted uncomfortably. That's ridiculous," Karen stammered. "We have legal counsel." "So do I," I replied, "and mine's on retainer. With the state's real estate commission." "Oh, and one more thing, Section 5. Clause A says that if any board member acts in bad faith toward the association, the president can remove them immediately. Guess what? That's both of you. Effective now." I slid 2 pre-written notices across the desk. "Consider yourselves removed from the HOA board." For the first time since I'd met her, Karen was speechless. She snatched the paper up, tore it in half, and threw it on my desk. "You can't do this," she screamed. I kept my voice calm. "Karen, you've been trying to steal my land since the day I moved in. Now it's over. If you step foot on this property again without my permission, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. And unlike your fake threats, mine will stick." Greg muttered something under his breath as they stormed out, but I didn't even care. I'd won another battle, but I knew the war wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to slink away quietly. Sure enough, later that evening, Daniel called again. "They're planning something bigger." Karen said, and I quote, "If we can't take it through the board, we'll take it through the county." That was a line that sent my mind racing. The county zoning office had the power to reclassify property use, and if Karen somehow got them to declare my ranch as community recreation land, I'd be stuck in legal limbo for years. I decided it was time to get ahead of her. The next morning, I drove down to the county office with my folder of historic preservation documents, tax records, and state-level approvals. I met with the head of zoning, a man named Howard who'd known my family for decades. When I explained what Karen was trying to do, he frowned and shook his head. "Ain't she's wasting her time," he said. "This ranch is protected under the Historic Land Act. I'll make a note in the file so no requests for reclassification can even be considered." That was the best news I'd heard all week. I thanked Howard, shook his hand, and headed back to the ranch. But as I pulled up the driveway, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. 3 SUVs parked just outside my gate. Karen was there, along with half a dozen people I didn't recognize. They were unloading surveying equipment. I parked my truck, got out, and walked toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out. Karen turned, smiling like she'd already won. "We're assessing the property for community development proposals," she said. "Can't stop who sets public interest now." "No," I said firmly, pulling my phone out and hitting record. "It's still my land. But if you set 1 foot past that gate, you're trespassing." She shrugged, turned back to her crew, and motioned them forward. That was the last straw. I called the sheriff's department right there on camera, explaining the situation in detail. The deputies arrived within 15 minutes and ordered Karen and her group to leave immediately. The humiliation on her face was priceless, but the way she glared at me as she drove off told me one thing: this wasn't her final move. When the day of the HOA's final confrontation arrived, the sky over the ranch was a deep, unbroken blue, as if even the weather wanted to witness the collapse of their arrogance. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching as a convoy of black SUVs rolled up my gravel drive, their tires spitting dust into the air. Out stepped Gregory, his vice president Ellen, and the usual collection of board members, each looking far less confident than the last time they came storming onto my property. But this time, they weren't here to demand my land. They had no power left to enforce anything, no legal footing to stand on. My team had dismantled their influence piece by piece, court order by court order, and now the state attorney's office had everything they needed to press charges for fraud, misuse of funds, and harassment. Still, Gregory put on a smug face, walking toward me as though the last few weeks of defeats hadn't happened. "This ends today," he said. "Yes, it does," I replied, stepping aside to reveal the uniformed state marshals waiting inside. My doorway. His smirk faltered, and I could see his confidence evaporate in real time. Ellen took a step back, her voice wavering as she tried to insist this was all a misunderstanding. But the lead marshal was already reading them their rights. Neighbors began gathering at the edge of the property, murmuring in disbelief as the once untouchable HOA leaders were placed in handcuffs. I walked out to the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had lived under their intimidation for years. "You're free now," I said simply. "The HOA as you knew it is gone. And as the new president, I can promise you one thing: we're going to rebuild this community on respect, not control." Applause broke out, tentative at first, but growing until it echoed against the hills surrounding the ranch. Gregory shot me a venomous glare as he was loaded into the SUV, but I didn't care. His reign was over, and the land my family had cherished for 150 years was finally safe. Later that night, as the sun set behind the ranch house and bathed the fields in gold, I realized this was more than just a victory for MIT, it was a victory for every neighbor who had ever been bullied, silenced, or pushed into a corner by an HOA drunk on power. And if you've ever been in that position, if you've ever wished someone would finally stand up to them, then subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the fight against HOA abuse is far from over, and you won't want to miss what comes next.